So welcome back. So this is part 2 of my 3-week ADG series. And as I said last week, a recurring theme for me in questions about religion is, who are we and why do we come together? So my hope is that these talks will stimulate conversations to help us explore those questions. And now there may be a few objective facts, more than a few sprinkled in here, but a lot of it is my opinions and interpretations and whatever. And so you are, of course, free to create your own interpretations and opinions. So please, join in, and folks online, feel free to chime in as well. This week, since we're in a smaller room, hopefully the mic will pick up everybody in the room, so you don't have to pause to have us hand you a microphone, because hopefully everybody on Zoom will hear. Zoom folks, please feel free to join in as well, and just mute yourself when you're done so we don't get background noise, right? So for me personally, the best outcome today would be that our conversation becomes so interesting and interactive that I don't get through all the material I've presented that I prepared, right? That would be great. Second best would be I get to say all the nifty stuff I've thought about, and that will inspire other people to say, oh, I want to do one of those too, and come up with their own ADG program and lead the show here. So that's kind of my thoughts on this process in general. So as I did last week, I'm going to draw some ideas and motivation from this book, Reza Aslan, God, A Human History, because I may have heard this yet last week, but very quickly. I mean, when we talk about any given religious or faith, we usually have an origin story, and it all traces back to the beginning of the universe, the beginning of the world, whatever. But how do you get outside of that and really see, well, what is this phenomenon of religion in human history? Well, this does that. He doesn't, just trace back to Genesis or something like that, but really goes back much farther. So last week we talked about sort of the prehistory of religion, and now we're going to start to get into historical terms. So the big idea that was, really, really transformed the way I think about these things from last week was that religion predates agriculture, and here's the evidence, right? This is the so-called Temple of Eden at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. And it's widely recognized as the earliest religious temple yet discovered. It was built between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago. And so that makes it at least 6,000 years before Stonehenge and 7,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramids. And before agriculture. That's the crucial point. I mean, this is mind-boggling to me, and it really changes the relationship, the cause and effect of how we became human civilization the way we are now. And so the author says that the folks who constructed this temple would have been coming from as much as 100 miles away, and they came together to create this ritual art and architecture that focused on a common unifying symbol, the humanized God. They didn't come here because the food was better or anything like that. It was before all of that, before agriculture. And
so when you talk about agriculture, rather than hunter-gatherers, because when I pulled up plants,
right?
You're talking about actually planting
crops,
planting to harvest them.
And
when
pulling herds.
What are you referencing, and where? What part of the world?
Oh, well. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, but what he says is that happened around 10,000 years ago.
Got it. Thanks.
So this is at least a couple thousand years before that, so that means these were hunter-gatherer people. And I mean, my understanding as a kid was, oh, okay, agriculture, we have more reliable sources of food, and we're healthier and happier and safer and all that stuff. Turns out that was wrong. That actually people came together long before that for religious reasons. So religion drove us to civilization rather than food, clothing, and shelter driving us to civilization? That was a shock to me. Oh, and now okay, there's some detailed carvings. If you look at each of these pillars, the big standing stones, is this highly abstracted human form, that their God, right? So that's if you zoom in on that. You can see in the individual posts here, this all the carvings that, yes, it's a person, right, wearing a loincloth, and there's the arms and all that stuff, but it's purposely abstract. Not that they couldn't do exquisitely detailed carvings, they did jaguars or leopards where you could see the ribs and things like that. So they were capable of that. They chose to leave these the heads, the faces neutral, and so that's part of the evidence that says that these were not specific people, but abstracted gods.
So Bill, were
Yeah.
this picture right here, is that big tower? There's the two big towers.
Right. That's the base, and so the top is the big block is the head, right?
Okay.
And then what we're showing zoomed in there is the vertical post, and that's the stylized body of the god.
You know when this was discovered?
Oh, I don't know the date on that. I'm sure it's in the book. Yeah, it's a while ago. It's at least 15 years ago, something like that. It's
Fairly recent.
It's not 100 years ago. It's relatively recent. Yeah. There are glyphs on these stones, but we don't have a Rosetta Stone to know what they say. So perhaps this makes this the last prehistoric civilization, because they wrote down a history, but we can't read it, so they're prehistoric to us, right? So Aslan explains that viewing gods in this way represented a break from earlier animism, in which not just people, but animals, plants, rocks, everything had this spirit in it. But now there was a shift. There was a split between us and nature. And think about that. Well, why are we not part of nature? I mean, we're living creatures here. But at some point in human history, there was this split. There's all of everything else, and then there's humans, and we're different and we're special from nature. We're not just a part of nature. And that was mirrored in creating these gods who were abstract humans. We were different because we were like the gods, and so that was really a significant shift in the religious or spiritual framework of human beings at that particular time. But the thing again that I thought was shocking is how early this happened. One author that's quoted in the book referred to the early agriculture as history's biggest fraud, because, and this is, I said this last week, but I just thought it was kind of significant. Skeletons from the first few thousand years of the Neolithic Revolution, that is the beginning of agriculture, human height dropped 6 inches on average due to inadequate diet. So Aslan, by the way, Aslan interprets the story of Adam and Eve as a folk memory of a time before agriculture, when people were hunter-gatherers and they didn't have to work so hard, they didn't have to struggle endlessly to get enough food. So that really turns things on their head. I mean, if you didn't come together, if these diverse groups didn't come together to improve your access to food, clothing, and shelter, you're actually worse off. Why the heck would you do it? Turns out, strongly suggests you did it for the greater glory of God, as they understood it, right? That was the motivation. And they made all these sacrifices, eating meagerly and all this other stuff, because this was more important. Wow, that's kind of a jolt, I think.
Bill, I can chime in here with that answer for the question.
Oh.
Buried for 10,000 years, the sacred site was discovered quite by accident in 1994.
Okay.
German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt was called in for his expertise, and what he unearthed created a quandary of our understanding of humanity.
Right.
So 1994.
Okay, so a little longer than I thought, about 26 years. Yeah, okay. And yeah, so but relatively recently. Yeah, to me, it's a big deal. I don't know
much of it is excavated yet either.
I don't know all the details. Yeah.
Actually, Wikipedia says it was discovered in '63, but only excavation began.
Oh.
So
So they didn't really know what was there yet.
well, the site was known, but had not been archaeologically excavated.
Right. Yeah. Because there was this huge mound on top of this hill. Right. Yeah. So but the thing is, I mean, this idea that what drove the emergence of civilization was not food, clothing, shelter, but worship, actually makes me kind of uncomfortable because I'm an engineer. I mean, it's about solving practical problems, right? It's not the big driver. I mean, that's the way I thought this stuff worked. I mean, this is, I mean, every creator in the world has to, eat and drink and, have a habitat. And all this, this other stuff like, music and literature and religion. I mean, that stuff sounds like it's, added little extras.
For safety too.
Yeah, right. So that would, and I guess it's a little hard to puzzle that out. If they, from the archaeological evidence, could you tell, were they safer from being attacked at night in their sleep by being together, by coming together? So it's a little harder to tell that one for sure, but clearly it wasn't for food. And so the thing is, though, if you think about it, what is the real order of these things in human history? Music, entertainment, fun, but actually, music predates the human species, right? It may even predate mammals because there are birds sing too, right? And I think it's quite plausible that music was that facility of making music is what made language possible, right? That it was just more and more specialized, that sound means this, and then, you can easily imagine things evolving that way. So in public education, art and music, those are little added extras. Those are, maybe even optional in terms of the way they're funded. But maybe they're really foundational to our existence as a civilized species. Maybe without that, we wouldn't have language. And maybe without religion, we wouldn't have civilization. I mean, you think about it, when you study history, you study the history of wars a lot more than the history of religion, unless the religion caused the war, right? I mean, what we prioritize isn't necessarily the same as the priority in actual history, the other meaning of priority, right? And so I think it's worth, thinking about the actual cause and effect over the course of history and how important music and religion may be in our human history. So
Bill,
yeah, go ahead.
So this idea that troubles you over, what came first, or my question would be, could it be that people would pray, much like in an agricultural setting, they would pray for rain, and then when the harvest came, they would give their tithe to God and thank God for the tithe? Could it be that people gathered likewise for the rain, just to be able in times of drought, or as hunter-gatherers, they were praying for wild game?
Oh, sure. Oh, yes, and you're saying they may have perceived this as solving practical problems.
Exactly.
In their universe.
Yeah,
right.
This God will provide
right
for us. And both settings sort of have a common hypothesis there that God was created to be able to meet our needs.
Right, right. Yeah. So it may not have been, yeah. Now, but somehow they didn't notice that they were hungrier and getting shorter for a couple hundred years there until they really figured out this agriculture thing. But I don't know, stranger things have happened, right? I mean, we're still waiting for Jesus to pop out from wherever it is he's been hiding for 2,000 years, you know? So sometimes people can really hang on to these ideas, even in the absence of compelling evidence that they are true.
So, Bill, recent example, I mean, we're told that life expectancy as a result of the pandemic has increased by multiple years.
Decreased.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that noticeable to you or I?
Oh, right. Yeah, how would you get the statistics? How would you know?
How would you, well,
Yeah.
how would you perceive that if
Yeah.
no one's really
Keeping track.
keeping track of that, right?
You asked the
And even,
same.
well, even now you might question, it's like, well, I'm not a statistician or, someone who deals with mortality
Right.
populations, but how do they come up with that?
How do they know that? Yeah.
Supposedly our,
Right.
expectancy of decline.
Right. So there's just a lot of different factors that go into why humans behave the way they behave. And it's not always simply, where's my next meal coming from? In a very simplistic, straightforward way. We've got a complex picture of the nature of our world. And that's what we operate in, is our mental picture of our world, not the world. Hopefully our picture is somewhat related, but yeah, it can be different. Now, one thing that Frank asked a question last week that I kind of dodged, but I want to loop back to it, because he said, well, how are you defining spirituality? I was just sort of treating it, I hadn't really thought specifically about giving it a definition per se. I was treating it as my term in this context as the ground in which religion grew, right? It's sort of the proto-religious background to what these human potentialities were that gave rise to religion. But actually, let's look at it more specifically, because I think it's just dissect the word. I mean, the dictionary definition of spirituality is a quality or state of being spiritual, concern for that which is unseen or intangible as opposed to physical or mundane, appreciation for religious values. Okay, so spirituality has to do with being spiritual. Spiritual is defined as of or pertaining to the spirit, soul, or God. So therefore, spiritual people are ones that view themselves as having a spirit or a soul. And where did that idea come from? Well, Aslan writes, the truthful answer is that we don't know. What seems clear, however, is that the belief in the soul may be humanity's first belief. Indeed, if the cognitive theory of religion is correct, belief in the soul is what led to belief in God. The origin of the religious impulse, in other words, is not rooted in our quest for meaning or our fear of the unknown. It is the result of something far more primal and difficult to explain, our ingrained, intuitive, and wholly experiential belief that we are, whatever else we are, embodied souls. Things that spirits in the material world, whatever, right? I mean, that's the idea that that's at the root of it all. That didn't get invented, because my version of things was, we invented civilization to get better food, clothing, and shelter. And once we were all together, we needed some way to order our societies. So we had to make rules, and to give support to those rules, we had invented this theology and stuff like that to underpin our rule system. That's the wrong order. I was mistaken about that, okay? This idea, this intuitive sense that I am more than my body, there's something else. There is that seems to be really primal.
But those other things follow, Bill. Those things that you just listed.
Right, but the sequence, I had the sequence wrong. I thought we invented this idea of souls, so we'd have a report card on which to keep track of our sins. But it wasn't done in that order.
Was it Karl Marx that said religion is the opiate of
Opiate of
masses?
masses, yeah.
So that along that line, right? Religion was created to
To control
be an
mass.
opiate, to be and appease the anxiety of humanity.
And I mean, I was a good church-going kid when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s and all that stuff, and I never believed that stuff. That was, evil atheists that believe that stuff. But still, I think there's a certain amount of it that you take in, and when it's that much in the culture, that that it's easy to, it's like, I mean, I didn't maybe think it was something sinister, the way opiate of the masses, but it's like, no, we're cultivating good behavior so that we as a society can constructively interact and live together. And so that's a good thing, right? I didn't see it as a, evil controlling thing. It's like, no, it's good to have rules. It's good that this red octagon makes people stop so we don't crash into each other. That's a good thing. Rules are not bad per se. I mean, there are rules that are bad, but the rules, a lot of times it's just like, when we meet each other, do we go to the right or the left? Well, we all go to the right. That way we don't bump into each other. I mean, it doesn't matter, but just having rules makes life easier.
I'm curious if the author then posits other theories for it, like this idea that we're wired to be in community. This idea that a child that's neglected physically at birth will have psychological damage.
Or just be dead.
Well, not being held, right? So they have that estranged, I can't remember what it's called, but there's an actual psychological term for it.
Yeah.
Where you get these orphans.
Institutionalized kids that don't get the right amount of contact.
And they have a hard time, attachment disorder.
Right.
So there's this fundamental idea that humanity needs to come together. We need each other.
Right.
For encouragement, for nurture, for physical touch. And the theological perspective would say, God created us this way.
Right.
That we are wired to be in community. In fact, the Trinity is all about this concept of God is community. God is one, but God is three. Greece is the holy dance.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what the author has to say about that.
Yeah, I don't know that he spoke to that specifically. But it's
what does he theorize is the reason they got together 10,000 years ago?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it was just this impulse. I mean, what the level at which he's saying is that, because as he says, beliefs don't fossilize, right?
Yeah.
So there's only what you can get from the fossil record, right, is what we've got at that level. And what it says is, prehistorically, they had this idea of a God, apparently, right? I mean, he'd go back that far, that they had created these gods. So they had already gotten to that level of abstraction before recorded history. Right, that's what this tells us, and so it's hard to know, because by the time we got to recorded history, all this stuff was thousands of years old, and so it was already baked into our brains and our culture and our society. So I think it's.
I'm curious if the date that he's giving for this is tied to some astrological event. Because we live in a light polluted society, but they were all about the stars.
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, I don't know if this particular one was oriented relative to rise and set of the sun or anything like that. I don't know. They didn't mention that, like Stonehenge, but this was 7,000 years before Stonehenge.
Okay, so that doesn't explain it either.
Yeah, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. So but the idea that this was a reason to come together, to travel dozens or even 100 miles, to come together to do this. They must have felt that it had some power. And probably, as you said, they probably felt we are going to be better off in some sense, right? We get right with God, and the hunt will be abundant, or whatever it is. But again, that doesn't fossilize. Why they did these things.
Well,
but that they did.
It's a brief reading I've done. They did say that this area was at one time forested and would have supported kind of the hunting gathering thing. Today it's like a wasteland.
Oh yeah. Interesting.
And this site was used for over 1,000 years. They think like over the course of like 1,500 years. Which is a pretty long period of time.
Right. So it remained important to a lot of people for a lot of years.
In multiple stages or different evolutions.
Yeah.
So why it fell out of order might have been, or out of use might have been, well, there was nothing close enough to it to sustain life. So that they more or less were moving further and further away from it just to sustain themselves. I don't know.
Yeah, but you know, this idea of soul is something that kind of bothers philosophers, you know, and they sometimes talk about like the homunculus fallacy, which actually made it into a movie. I mean, this is not our experience of soul. We're not the little alien driving the robot, right? It's not just a thing in our head. It is our being, right? I mean, it's us in the world. Now, we might get a little, you know, the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder, but that's not really the way we feel most of the time, I think. We just feel that we're embodied consciousness, we're embodied souls. Yeah.
Maybe it's in our DNA.
Well, yeah, I think that's for sure. But how did it get there? You know?
God created.
There's a book called God Gene.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, and so what is? But there is something in us that seeks that, right? There is something in our nature, in our cognition. Just like there's something in us that causes us to do these weird things called language, to a much more complex degree than any other species on the planet. We've got some facility for that. Yeah, I like Chomsky better than Skinner and those kinds of debates, you know, about behavioralism versus, you know, an innate facility for language. And I think there's got to be some kind of innate facility for religion also. I think that's part of who we are. And even if like, for instance, there's less and less attendance at churches now, but look at the passionate intensity with which people go to Comic-Con, with which people, you know, devote themselves to Star Trek and Star Wars and, you know, pick your, you know, Lord of the Rings and whatever. Well, I think that those kinds of mythological things may be fulfilling, you know, the same kind of primal urge. So the thing is, if you say, you know, if your ethics says, you know, what would Buddha do? What would Lao Tzu do? What would Jesus do? What would well, what if instead it's what would Harry Potter do, or what would Spock do, or what would Yoda do? I mean, I think it may, you know, for whatever sociological reasons, some people have a negative attitude towards religion now, but they still seem to be looking for something, some kind of, you know, archetype of virtue, some kind of noble quest for our lives, right?
I'd like to distinguish between religion and worship. And if this is a gathering place for worship,
yeah,
then the fact that we have the Fiesta Bowl and the Rose Bowl, look at how they worship. Those people,
Yeah.
you know, we celebrated the Heisman,
Yeah.
not so much me, but yeah, but you know, raising hands, war paint, identity as I belong to this tribe.
Yeah.
These are my people, and vicariously.
And we sing songs if you're in the English Premier League, right? We have their own
And there are
songs.
symbols.
Yeah.
No horn frogs. So I think that we worship, we've just shifted who the God is or what the focus is. But
Right.
there's this innate human need to come together and emulate someone that's heroic, a giant, a beast.
We have
an
heroes. We have heroes, and there's titanic struggles that people talk about for years afterwards. Do you remember that Rose Bowl when, you know, whatever? So there's these legendary figures, you know, yeah. So there is some element of us, and it's not stapled on. It's not an appendage. You know, it's not something, you know, that's just, you know, a certain piece of our brain or whatever. Or a little man.
So Bill, is that so difficult to believe that there's something intrinsic in us?
Right. That's what I'm saying. But it's really, it's a part of us that does that.
So you would expect, if that were the case, that one could still go to very, very primitive cultures that have had no contact with the modern world and see that as well?
Yeah. So they have their own manifestations of this innate human characteristic.
But did you see any of that evidence in this book? I mean, they're, you know, extremely like cut off groups of people in pockets of the world that are still living very primitively and
Right.
have no contact with modernity at all.
Right. And some, one thing they mentioned is that animism is still fairly widespread in those kinds of cultures, the less, technological, more hunter-gatherer style cultures. So that it still really is that the spirit that imbues all of existence, as opposed to this particular God. And they have the mythologies of the origin stories and all that, but it's maybe not a localized God. It's not the God we put in one particular package, one particular human manifestation, or invisible human manifestation. So so I think there's lots of different ways that it is still expressed in humanity. Yeah. And one thing that I kind of wonder about as far as this genesis of the idea of dream, of soul, is dreams. Because one experience that I've had, and I suspect everybody's had it, anybody above a certain age, is I'm in a familiar setting, talking to a family member, friend, whatever, just chatting. Suddenly I'm gripped with a sense of, guilt or apprehension, because like, ooh, I thought you were dead. How could I have made a mistake that big? How could I have thought you were dead? Obviously, I'm sitting here talking to you. And this is not a replay of a conversation we've had before. It's another conversation, just like ones we've had before. But I'm so embarrassed. How could I have thought you were dead? And of course, that happens right as you're waking up. That's why you remember it. But it's when your conscious mind and your unconscious mind are somehow starting to whisper to each other or something like that. But I kind of wonder if that, the emotional impact of that wouldn't really have a formative effect on how we think about the world. I mean, and especially, 10,000 years ago. I mean, think about, infant mortality and child mortality rates back then. Even at a young age, people knew a lot of dead people, a lot more than I did, when I was 20. And so I wonder if that made people think, well, wait, there's this, they're not here anymore, but they still exist. They're still there. They're in dreamland. They're in that other place that I visit when I'm dreaming. And if you think about the idea of the shaman and stuff like that in various religious traditions, there is this idea of sometimes, chemical enhancement to get to dreamland in some way. That idea that domain of dreams is a real thing that can really inform our lives. I kind of wonder if that's not the nugget, the kernel of ideas like heaven. That might have been the inspiration, and then we just developed those ideas over the centuries, over the millennia. And one other thing that I think suggests that idea is the importance of dreams is probably less now than it was 100 years ago or whatever. But if you think about, the story of Fiddler on the Roof, I don't know, I've probably already seen that, but there's this scene where Tevye, his oldest daughter, has told him, I don't want to marry the butcher, I want to marry the tailor, when we promised, and when we've been friends since we were children. And so he actually fibs to his wife and tells him he had a dream. Tells her he had a dream. She says, oh, tell me what it is, I'll tell you what it means. And then he tells the whole story that basically, convinces her that we got to cut off this deal with the butcher and let her marry the tailor. Because, well, the thing is, I don't think, obviously it's funny because we, the audience, know he's making this up just to bail his daughter out of this problem and let her marry the guy she loves. But the thing is, I don't think the idea is that we're ridiculing this woman. Because I think the idea is that in that place, in that time, that was a reasonable reaction for this person to make to this dream that, God is telling us something. The dreamland is telling us something important about how we ought to proceed with our lives. And so, if that's now, I don't know that resonates much with a lot of people, in my circle anymore. But also Sigmund Freud, coming from a totally different place, was convinced that dreams were deeply, deeply important and stuff like that. And I'm not sure we necessarily believe this stuff so much as we did, 100 years ago either. But the thing is, though, that the fact that dreams were so important and have been so important in the history of humanity suggests to me that experience may be tied to our idea that even when our bodies no longer exist, we still exist somewhere, and that dream state, dreamland, heaven, that I think that may all be stitched together in some way in our history.
Bill, we have several things flying in my head right now that you're stimulating, but one of them is, tomorrow night we're having this festival of light at the synagogue, and we'll be getting together a Lutheran, a Jew, and a UCC pastor together to explore the idea of peace. But the book that the two authors who will also be there on this panel of this book called Festival of Light are there to explore. The book was written to explore different values, right? Values, and if you think of religion as a form of evolution, where we've decided the survival of the species, subconsciously decide the survival of species will be enhanced if we have, as you mentioned, rules, stop signs, but also core values. And what we're doing is we're gathering together tomorrow night, and we're talking about one value of peace, this one concept of peace. What does peace mean? We go back into the 70s, listen to all the songs of the hippie revolution, whatever, on peace. And it's gonna be cool, and then poetry and whatnot. But there's this common bond even now with different religions to say, okay, we can disagree on our creation stories or our sacred texts, but we have this commonality of seeing the worth of soul-like concepts, right? Philosophies, ideas, characteristics of our humanity that are not materialistic. Fundamentally, they're relational.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wonder if it's related. One thing I've thought about is if you think about that, what would Jesus do? What would Buddha do? What would Lao Tzu do? Well, as long as you're not asking a specifically theological or cosmological question, but you're asking something about life, wouldn't they always all do the same thing? That's my little challenge to myself. Think of a case where Jesus and the Buddha would give you totally different answers. It's like, I don't think that happens. I mean, at the level of how ought we to live our lives, I think we really are in enormous agreement in a lot of ways.
Of course, religion, dreams played a huge role in our Bible. Today, I'll be preaching from Isaiah, who was a prophet. Right. Prophets were known to both foretell and foretell, right. and do so by having this innate power to discern a message from a deity. Yeah. Right.
And probably in kind of a dreamlike meditative state or something like that.
And historically, you've got scholars saying, yeah, Isaiah probably wrote that after the exile, or after the return. So you got that whole, challenge. But
the Texas sharpshooter, you shoot the whole thing and then
exactly. But nevertheless, that aside, that concept is there, right? That there's something more than that meets the eye.
Right.
To your point, this idea of a soul that probably comes in part by this common human experience of there's more to life than meets the eye. We have these values that resonate with us.
Right.
And we know we meet people that we like right away and meet people that we don't based on qualities of character that you can't measure by weighing.
Yeah.
Right, or molecular, I know they're trying to map the human mind right now.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it,
Slicing
but the map is not the territory.
Trying to figure out consciousness, right? Scientists are going after that too, right now.
Yeah. So one thing that as far as what is ultimately real, one thing that I really like in the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling has included what I think was an interesting insight, At the end, spoiler alert for this, I haven't read the book from 20 years ago. So there's a near-death experience that Harry has. And he finds himself in this, familiar yet unfamiliar place, talking to his old friend, Professor Dumbledore, who died a year ago, right? And after discussing why Voldemort's curse didn't actually kill him, what the hell happened here? Harry asks Dumbledore, tell me one last thing. Is this real? Or has this been happening inside my head? Dumbledore beamed at him, and his voice sounded loud and strong in Harry's ears, even though the bright mist was descending again, obscuring his figure. Of course it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real? And then he wakes up, and then on we go with the story. But so the idea that if it's just in our head, it's not real, why? I mean, 73 is just in our head. I mean, it's not a fact in the universe. Numbers are not objective facts in the universe. There's these abstractions that we create in order to understand, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which we construct maps, models of our world. So to what degree is the electromagnetic field real? Or to what degree is it just something we made up? It's kind of both. So one other thing I'd like to talk about, like heaven and all such things, is souls and the idea of the afterlife. Now already in my late teens or 20s or something like that, I had already kind of decided that a second temporal existence wasn't going to happen. I didn't see any basis for believing that. But I had concocted this kind of alternate version, which was that imagine an atemporal experience of your entire life. So imagine, you've got a movie, and you're going to be able to look at every frame of the movie simultaneously and not have that be a chaotic mess, but actually have it be meaningful, right? So you could actually perceive your entire existence laid out in front of you, like a mural or whatever, right? Or it's a mural that's scrolling past you, but you only get to work on this piece at a time. You don't get to go back there and fix what you got wrong last time. You just so if our atemporal existence is simply a vivid, complete understanding of our life and what it has meant, then that would have to be one kind of experience if you're Mother Teresa. It would be a different kind of experience if you're Adolf Hitler, and it would be something in between for most of us. So that got kind of rid of the binary heaven versus hell thing that I didn't like too much. But it still hung on to this idea of sort of an ultimate reckoning for what we've done with our lives or failed to do with our lives. As I get older, I'm getting even more heretical, and I question whether any afterlife, even that atemporal version, really exists. But to me, religion is meaningful because regardless of whether or not my soul is going to exist after I'm dead, it exists now. I mean, my body's not going to exist after I'm dead, but I try to take good care of it now because it does exist. And so why not the same thing with the soul? It is a real feature of what it means to be a human being. We have souls. Whether they exist after death or not, that's another question, but we got them now. And so why not, tend to them the same as we tend to our physical health? Now you know why they don't ask me to preach upstairs.
We're leaving not because we don't like you. We're singing in the choir.
Yeah. So
might join us, Bill.
Yeah. So I'll get there as soon as I can. Yeah, we'll conclude here. Yeah, our choir members are disappearing, and I'm one of them too. But I can't leave early. If any of you have ever seen the TV show The Good Place. I really recommend it. It's a lot of fun because the thing is, it does in a lighthearted, fun way. It gets at some very serious ideas about what afterlife might mean, what heaven and hell might be, and so they actually they actually try out different stuff. They're actually, the star of the show is so good, she gets to change what the afterlife is like. That's the teaser there. But I think it gets at some really basic questions about what it means, what it could mean for there to be an afterlife. I guess I kind of like the Buddhist version where we go back to the ground of being as opposed to retaining our individuated existence. As I said, Aslan's book traces the evolution of gods that parallels our human social evolution. And so you start off with the gods of the hunt, and those gave way to the gods of fertility. And some of those gods of fertility got buried and came back to life. What do you know? Kind of like crops, kind of like Jesus. So between about 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, residents began burying under their homes skulls that were covered in plaster and reconstructed to look alive. Even including little pearly colored shells in the eye sockets to make the eyes. And so this was discovered in Jericho, and what that represents, here's a picture of one from the book. This one was discovered in Jericho, as I said. And so at this point in the evolution of religious beliefs, there were these family shrines, and this was a part of that. And so the idea here was that humans were, again, special, not just like every other, plant, animal, and rock and river, that we were special. We had this special relationship to God. And so these family shrines are evidence of what they refer to as manism or ancestor worship. And so this was a way of having your ancestor, your recently deceased ancestor, intercede with you for on your behalf with the forces of nature, right? So by in the soil from where our sustenance comes, so we put the ancestor's skull, reconstructed skull, in there, and the idea is that this ancestor can therefore be working on our behalf to communicate with the spirits that exist and create everything that we live on, right? And so that means, again, this is that transition where humans are now different from everything else. So this is some of these ancestors then, as time went on, some of these ancestors turned into gods, actually, over time, and eventually, so you had the ancestor communing with these natural forces, and then eventually you sort of take out the middleman, and the humanized person becomes the god that controls, the wind or the harvest or the whatever the force of nature is, the sun, right? And so there was this progression in human thought about the nature of forces, human beings, and how we interacted with them, and to what degree we could influence them. And so then we've got eventually this kind of idea of gods as lofty persons, and we have whole pantheons that have different roles and responsibilities, right? And we've got the god of war, the god of the oceans, and all these different basically society, on Mount Olympus or whatever it was, right? But the thing is that eventually those gods got so humanized that they became, in a way, kind of mundane. I mean, they were they were engaged in the same kind of bad behavior as the humans on Earth were. It's like, why are they worthy of so much worship? And so at some point, people sort of then migrated towards thinking, is there a better way of formulating all this. You know, they wanted an idealized God, a perfect God, an all-powerful God. And that starts us down the path toward monotheism. So starting around the first experiment with monotheism, it turns out, it was starting around 1353 BCE in Egypt. Someone known as the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. He tried to eliminate the entire pantheon except his one god, the sun god, Amun-Re. Okay, there was going to be no other god. In fact, he actively tried to destroy all the other temples and all the other images and the other writing, all the things that would keep these gods alive. And so he actually actively repressed all other forms of worship. And so this was practically a pogrom against all the gods of Egypt. But in spite of this overwhelming force, it didn't change people's hearts. And after he died, the religion that he had created, the sun god worship, got repressed just as vigorously as he had tried to do to all the prior versions. And his son was named Tutankhaten. He changed his name to Tutankhamun, or King Tut. So it's kind of remarkable that we even know about his father at all, because there was such an extreme reaction against his really zealous monotheism. And so then, okay, the next episode that we know about with monotheism was Zarathustra in Iran around 1100 BCE. He was struck by a blinding white light. He was a priest, or a practitioner of the prevailing religion, but he was struck by this blinding white light and this vision, and he came to believe in just one God. And so that but the thing is, he didn't convert a lot of people, and it fell into obscurity after he died. It got resurrected centuries later, but in the process, it got changed from what he had in mind as absolutely monotheistic religion to a dualistic one, where there were two gods, the god of good and the god of evil, who were in this endless cosmic battle for the souls of humanity. And so again, monotheism kind of didn't make it. And so now, in our culture, it's probably safer to just reject religion entirely and walk away than to seriously criticize the principle of monotheism, right? I mean, it's so ingrained in our society and in our religious systems. But these two ancient examples show that monotheism can easily lead to intolerance of other belief systems. I mean, because, one fun new word I learned in this book, monolatry is the worship of only one God. So if there are a bunch of gods out there, I'm worshiping only one. Monotheism is different. Monotheism says there are no other gods. Everything else is a fraud. Everything else is a fake. There is only one God. And I know, and I know which one it is, you know. So there is a danger of a certain kind of arrogance in that viewpoint. It's not a pluralistic worldview. And you know, even if we force ourselves to believe that Father plus Son plus Holy Spirit equals one God, equals Yahweh, equals Allah, but teachings aren't really all the same. But okay, but somehow or other we've decided we're going to convince ourselves that that's one God. How does that solve the problem of Hinduism? Or, you know, any other of the belief systems all over the world? So you know, my next heresy, not only do I have questions about heaven, but also questions about monotheism. Because the thing is, my view is the universe is one. There's only one universe and we're all living in it, right? But as we endeavor to figure out stuff about that universe, we human beings construct mental models of that universe. And our mental models are not the universe. The map is not the territory. So we make our best approximation, but if we have some degree of humility about it and say, I've got an approximation, it explains a lot of stuff. It works really well for me in various domains. But does that mean that my approximate map of the universe has to be better than everybody else's? I mean, why can't everybody make their own map of the universe? And maybe we'll get an even better picture if we all compare notes, compare our maps of the universe and figure out, oh, there's an insight I hadn't had before. I mean, that was my experience when I started reading about, Taoism and Hinduism and Buddhism, is that, oh, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's common, but there are insights that it's a different way of looking at things. And yeah, I hadn't examined things in that particular way before. So I mean, I really wish, I mean, as I said, I'm always rooting for universalism. And I kind of wonder whether true universalism is really consistent. Well, it is not consistent, let's say, with strident monotheism. I'm right, everything else is wrong. That's not universalism, that's not pluralism, and I don't think that attitude is a virtue. I think it's gotten the world into a lot of trouble. So the thing is, well, okay, so I'm, I'm going to try and invent a better version of religion and bring all the world together and we'll all hold hands. And, well, Thomas Jefferson had an idea about this topic. I mean, he believed, or he said, there's not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. So he thought that since we had gotten rid of the divine right of kings and we were Enlightenment people and all that stuff, that, oh, okay, everybody's going to come around to this sort of rationalistic approach to the Christian tradition. Great, and Jesus is the best, an ideal teacher, but he didn't create the universe, and that kind of thing, right? So Jefferson was sure, oh, okay, this is obviously true, and so everybody will come around to this in no time at all. Well, he was obviously very wrong. We didn't all, that generation didn't all magically switch over to this. I mean, so what is the basis? What ties us to our religious traditions? It's not just some rational argument. There's a lot more to it than that. And so he had his idea about how we were going to all come together to some common understanding. And I think I'm probably drawn in the same way that he was to this kind of approach to things, like this rationalistic approach. But that apparently didn't make him qualified to predict the future, and it probably doesn't make me qualified to predict the future either, about what really goes into making religions vibrant and viable. Yeah, it's. But we can look back even further in history for this kind of approach to theology, like Plato and Pythagoras and many other Greek thinkers question the fundamental nature of God. This idea of committing adultery and all that other kinds of stuff that they were doing up on Mount Olympus didn't seem like necessarily the basis for the best possible religious framework. So they viewed God as a unified principle steering all of creation, unchanging and singular. Now, regardless of the philosophical merits of that idea, few people got interested in following it. It fell by the wayside. So I mean, now a similar sort of formulation of ultimate creative force. Oh, it sounds like unified field theory. Physicists like me think that sounds great. Yeah, but given the history, would it really turn out any differently now? If we try to invent such a religion, there may be practical advantages to ethical behavior, but that may not be enough to engender religious community. There's something about the music and mythology and all those other things that are really essential, and for reasons that we may not fully comprehend yet, but that are really woven into the fabric of our being. So maybe time for one more little story here. Yeah, let's do this. Yeah, so one thing that that is a recurring theme for me is the personification of God. And when is that a useful, positive, constructive thing? And are there situations in which it might be misleading or unhelpful? Like there's a story, this was from a Unitarian minister back in World War II. And this parishioner came to him and said, and she was so happy because her son was on a troop ship that was torpedoed and her son survived. And she was sure it was because she prayed for him every single day. And his reaction was, do you actually believe that God let all those other boys die because their mothers were insufficiently pious? Probably not the way you're supposed to do that as a minister. You're supposed to be sympathetic and supportive of your parishioners, but it does pose a real question there, right? I mean, this kind of interaction, this kind of agency, you know, and getting God to do me favors and stuff like that, I really have serious problems with that conception of the personalized God. But I think there's enormous value in our idealized conception of this archetypal figure whom we should all emulate. That to me seems extremely valuable. And the idea that we are all children of the benevolent creator, that mental image is really powerful to me. And so here's a little story that I heard. This was on an old NPR program, not on anymore, but it was called On Being, or before that it was Speaking of Faith. This was Krista Tippett. But anyway, she was interviewing this guy, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, and he told this story about the kids in his temple, right? So the class, he was speaking to them, and he asked them, do you believe in God? No one did. And he was crushed because he's thinking, your grandparents suffered so much. So many of your relatives died in the Holocaust, for their faith. And here, you ungrateful little wretches are. I mean, he didn't say it quite like this, but in the story. But no appreciation for the enormous value of what has been bequeathed to you. You're just dismissing it. But then later on in the conversation, he said, "Have you ever felt close to God?" And almost all of them had. They almost all had some story about how they felt close to God. How in the world is this logically possible, right? You don't believe in God when asked that question. And yet, here's places where you have communed with God, you have felt close to God, you have felt nurtured and sheltered by God. Who doesn't exist? What's going on? Well, the thing is, moving back to Harry Potter again, if you ask kids, have you ever felt close to Harry Potter? I could easily imagine they have. I have when I read the books to my kids when they were little. Do you believe in Harry Potter? No, because it's a different question. It's not, it's like, well, if it's all in my head, then is it real? Well, are Romeo and Juliet real? If they're just ideas in our heads, are they real? Well, the idea can be real, even if the physical person in the story isn't real. The ideas can be real. And so I kind of wonder if that's also the key to understanding what we mean by a personifiable God. It's not an invisible man hiding above the clouds, pulling the strings on the puppet show that we call life. It's an understanding of the nature of us as human beings and our commonality, the fact that we have a common ancestor, a common parent, and that we ought to feel ourselves to be members of this one family. And and this idea of, this archetype of moral perfection that we can all aspire toward. I mean, I think that sort of approach makes more sense to me as a scientist or whatever. And I just kind of wonder, is there a way to inject a little bit more of that into our tradition without destroying the mythology and and all those other intangibles that make it all work? But are there ways that we could make religion more accessible to the people that are somehow not connected? Because I think there is, as I said before, with the zealous connection to whether it's football or fantasy and adventure movies, all kinds of things. There's all this evidence that people have a need, have a longing, and I don't think social media is adequately fulfilling it.
Amen. Amen, yeah.
So we need to reinvent. I mean, this whole story says religion has been continuously reinvented for all of human history. It ain't just, that old time religion. It's not just one thing. The comma on the lapel, right? Don't put a period where God has placed the comma. We're still figuring this stuff out. We're still making better models, more relevant models for us as we exist now in the world. And so that's kind of my dream, that we can find ways to make these sorts of ideas more accessible, and we can nurture the spiritual needs of people who are, for whatever reason, turned off by the way it's been done for the last 100 years or whatever. So, yeah, well, I think that's probably a reasonable place to conclude. So, Mary, go ahead.
Just a question. You talked about that religion that King Tut. Actually, that's on PBS.
King Tut's dad, yeah.
The Secret of the Dad. I didn't see the whole show. I came in and I didn't know what they were talking about, the religion. But
Yeah.
But when did, I guess Judaism then is the next major religion? When was that?
Oh, well, actually, the dates on that, it was, Akhenaten was hold on. Yeah, so he was, oops. Yeah, it was like okay, yeah, 1100 BCE was Zarathustra, right? And then and it was a couple centuries before that, like 13 something BCE was the Egyptian.
Okay. And then when was Judaism? Judaism was back then.
Well, yeah, no, it was significantly later. I mean, obviously, I want to say it was from the beginning of the universe, and added the age of the saints at 10,000 years, but I think it's, I don't know for sure. I mean, Mike would probably know off the top of his head, but I think it's not more than 4,000 years, probably.
5,000 years.
5,000 years ago, something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so it had been around a long time, been around for maybe 3,000 years before Jesus, but it was not 10,000 years ago. It was not, and also there's all kinds of other fun things like, it turns out Yahweh and El were two different gods, two different Canaanite gods that somehow got turned into one god because there's the Yahwist strain of Jewish scriptures, and then there's the Elohist strain of scriptures, and somehow or another they bolted them together and made them one god. But they apparently, historically, according to this book, they weren't. They were two distinct gods. And yeah.
And Judaism is the oldest religion that's still followed today. I mean, other than maybe obscure religions and villages or something.
I don't know if Zoroastrianism is still practiced. I don't know.
So that goes back.
That goes back to 1100. But the thing is, it popped into existence and then died out at the end of that prophet's lifetime. But then it got resurrected hundreds of years later and totally morphed around, totally changed around. So yeah, it's hard to I mean, I haven't explored exactly the threads of individual, because he's more talking about the phenomenon of religiosity in the human species. And so he pulls these things out as examples, but he doesn't kind of follow each thread necessarily back to the, maybe you could if you dug in a little bit more. But it's and how closely do these threads adhere to earlier versions? And my son actually did a senior capstone project in religion in his undergraduate degree, and he was studying South Asian, focusing on South Asian religions, and he studied this one story and how much it evolved over the centuries. It was really interesting. It had to do with the caste system. And at the beginning, it was, untouchable, stay in your place. And by the end, it was, hey, priestly caste, be nice to the untouchables, and so it was just interesting to see how it could evolve that much over time. But there was a continuity. The reason I thought of it is because of what you were saying. There was a continuity that was considered one tradition, and yet over enough centuries, a particular story could get totally turned around because the changes were incremental enough that everybody could say, well, that's our tradition, that's our tradition, that's our tradition. If you hear something from here to there, they said, oh, what are you doing? That's something else. That's not our tradition. So there's this continuity of these incremental changes. And so it's still the same thing? I don't know. Yeah. So.